If the doors hadn't opened when they did, she would have told him the truth, and it would have changed everything. The elevator jerked so violently that Emily Carter had to brace herself against the cold steel wall, her breath catching somewhere between panic and exhaustion as the overhead lights flickered once, twice, then dropped into a dim, pulsing glow that painted everything in a dull red haze, like the building itself had stopped breathing. In her arms, Oliver let out a sharp cry, the kind that cut through silence and settled deep in the chest of anyone who heard it, and Emily instinctively pulled him closer, whispering soft, hurried reassurances against his fine blonde hair, though her own hands trembled enough to betray her calm. The space felt smaller by the second, as if the walls were inching inward, and the faint hum of the stalled cables above them echoed like a distant warning she couldn't quite understand. "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay," she murmured, even as her voice wavered. Even as she shifted her weight in worn flats that had seen too many long days, her reflection barely visible in the brushed metal panel. Pale, tired, but still holding together, because that was what she did. She held things together. Oliver's cries grew louder, filling the confined air, and Emily's eyes flicked toward the control panel, pressing the emergency button with a hope that felt thinner than it should have been, waiting for a voice, a sign, anything. But only static answered her at first, followed by a clipped, distracted tone through the intercom that sounded more annoyed than concerned. "Maintenance has been notified. Please remain calm," the voice said, already fading, already moving on to something else, and Emily swallowed the urge to apologize to no one in particular, because somehow it always felt like situations like this were her fault. "I'm sorry," she whispered anyway, more out of habit than necessity, bouncing Oliver gently, trying to soothe him with a rhythm that had worked on sleepless nights and long bus rides and quiet moments when the world seemed just a little too heavy. She didn't notice him. At first, not really, not until Oliver's cries shifted, faltered, as if sensing something different in the air, and Emily followed the subtle change with her eyes, turning slightly to see the man standing across from her, tall, still, composed in a way that didn't quite belong in a broken elevator. His suit was dark, perfectly cut, the kind of fabric that caught the dim light without losing its shape, and even in the flickering glow, there was a quiet authority in the way he held himself, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, like nothing about. This situation unsettled him. For a brief second, Emily felt self-conscious, acutely aware of the worn sleeve of her coat, the faint milk stain she hadn't had time to clean. The way Oliver's cries echoed louder in the presence of someone who clearly came from a different world, but the man didn't react the way she expected. No impatience, no irritation, just observation, calm and measured. Oliver let out another sharp wail, and Emily winced slightly, rocking him closer, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Please, just give me a second," though she wasn't sure who she was asking anymore. The man stepped forward then, not abruptly, not intrusively, just enough to close the space between them by a few feet, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying a warmth that didn't match the sharp lines of his appearance. "May I?" he asked, his eyes flicking briefly to Oliver before returning to her, waiting, not assuming, not taking, just offering. Emily hesitated, the instinct to protect flaring up for a fraction of a second, but exhaustion had a way of softening even the strongest walls. And there was something in his tone that felt safe, or at least not dangerous, and so, slowly, carefully, she shifted Oliver toward him. The moment Oliver settled into the man's arms, something changed, subtle, almost unbelievable. The cries softened, then quieted, replaced by small, uneven breaths as the man adjusted his hold with surprising ease, one hand supporting Oliver's back, the other resting gently against his tiny frame, moving in slow, practiced circles. Emily blinked, watching in quiet disbelief, her shoulders dropping for the first time since the elevator had stalled, as if the tension she'd been carrying had finally found somewhere to go. "How did you?" she started, her voice barely above a whisper, but the man only gave a faint, almost amused exhale, eyes still on the baby. "Sometimes they just need a different set of arms," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world, as if calming a stranger's child in a broken elevator was just another ordinary moment in his day. The red emergency light flickered again, casting shadows across his face, and for a second, Emily noticed something else beneath the composure. A flicker of something deeper, something that didn't quite belong to this moment alone. Oliver's small hand curled instinctively against the man's shirt, gripping the fabric with surprising strength, and the man stilled, just slightly, his breath catching in a way that was almost imperceptible. "What's his name?" he asked after a beat, his tone quieter now, more careful. Emily hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "Oliver," then added, almost without thinking, "Oliver Bennett." And that was when it happened. The smallest shift, the kind most people would miss. The man's gaze sharpened, not with suspicion, but with recognition, something immediate and undeniable, like a memory surfacing too quickly to be controlled. The silence that followed felt heavier than the stalled elevator, heavier than the flickering lights and the distant hum of cables overhead, and Emily suddenly became aware of the space between them again, of the way the air had changed, though she couldn't explain why. The intercom crackled back to life, breaking the moment with a burst of static and a voice that sounded far more alert this time. "We're restoring power now. Stand by." And the lights flickered brighter, the hum returning stronger, steadier, as if the building itself had decided to breathe again. Emily reached out instinctively as the man gently handed Oliver back to her, their fingers brushing for the briefest second, and in that moment, she felt it, a quiet certainty that this wasn't over, that whatever had just shifted between them wasn't something a set of opening doors could erase. The elevator jolted once more, then began to descend, slow and deliberate, and when it finally came to a stop, the door slid open to a flood of bright, polished light and a line of sharply dressed staff waiting outside, their posture straightening instantly as they saw him, voices overlapping in hurried respect. "Mr. Bennett." And Emily's breath caught again, but this time, it wasn't from fear, it was from realization, as she looked from their faces back to his, and understood, all at once, that the man who had just held her childlike, it mattered more than anything else in the world, wasn't just a stranger in a broken elevator. He was the one person she had never planned to meet again. Emily did not step out right away. Even as the polished marble lobby stretched wide before her, and the air shifted from cramped metal to cool, conditioned stillness, because something in the way everyone lowered their heads, something in the way they said his name, made her feel as if she had just crossed into a world that had never been meant for her. Oliver stirred softly in her arms, his tiny fingers curling into the fabric of her coat as if grounding her, and she tightened her hold without thinking, her eyes flicking back to Lucas Bennett, who had not moved, not yet, as though the open doors were waiting on him rather than the other way around. The staff stood in quiet anticipation, their posture precise, their expressions carefully neutral, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in the way one of them stepped forward slightly, a man in a tailored navy suit, who kept his voice low and respectful. "Sir, the board is waiting upstairs." And Lucas gave the smallest nod, the kind that acknowledged without committing, his attention still anchored somewhere behind him. Emily shifted her weight, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look, a young mother with a tired coat and a restless baby standing at the threshold of something far beyond her reach, and instinctively, she took a small step back, as if retreating might make her invisible again. "You should go," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes, her voice steady but soft, because it felt like the right thing to say, the only thing to say, and for a moment, Lucas did not respond. He looked at her then, fully this time, his gaze steady in a way that made it impossible to look away, as if he were searching for something in her face, something that did not belong to coincidence. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, edged with a question that carried more weight than the words themselves. "How old is he?" Emily blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. 6 months, she answered, adjusting Oliver slightly as he shifted against her shoulder, and Lucas inhaled slowly, as though measuring something invisible, something only he could see. The man in the navy suit cleared his throat gently, a reminder of time, of expectations, of a world that did not pause easily, and Lucas finally stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the lobby, but not without a final glance back at Emily, a look That lingered just a fraction longer than it should have, as if committing her to memory. The moment he moved, the room seemed to move with him, staff falling into step, voices lowering, the quiet choreography of power unfolding around him. And Emily felt it then. The distance, not just physical, but something deeper, something that stretched between who she was and who he was, a distance she had no intention of crossing. She turned slightly, ready to leave, ready to disappear back into the flow of ordinary life where elevators did not matter and names did not carry weight. But before she could take a full step, she heard it, her name, spoken clearly, firmly, from behind her. "Emily," Lucas said, and the sound of it stopped her more effectively than any touch could have. She froze, her breath catching as she turned back slowly, confusion flickering across her face because she had not told him, not in the elevator, not at all, and yet he said it like he knew it, like it belonged to him. Somehow. "How do you?" she began, but the question faltered before it could finish, because Lucas had already closed the distance again, his presence no longer distant, no longer just the man in the suit, but something more immediate, more personal, and there was something in his expression now that had not been there before, something unguarded, almost conflicted. "We need to talk," he said quietly, the same words as before but different now, heavier, carrying something that felt less like a suggestion and more like a necessity. And Emily hesitated, every instinct telling her to refuse, to walk away, to protect the fragile stability she had built with careful steps and quiet endurance. But Oliver shifted again, letting out a soft sound that broke through her thoughts, and she looked down at him, then back up at Lucas, caught between caution and something she could not quite name. Around them, the lobby continued to exist, people moving, conversations resuming in hushed tones, but it all felt distant, like a scene happening behind glass. And Emily realized with a quiet certainty that whatever this was, whatever had started in that broken elevator, it was not something she could simply step away from. "I do not have much time," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest, and Lucas gave a faint nod, as if he had expected nothing less, as if time itself was something he could negotiate with but not control completely. He gestured toward a quieter corner of the lobby, away from the flow of people, where a set of low chairs and a small table sat near a tall window that let in soft afternoon light. And Emily followed, her steps careful, measured, every movement grounded in the need to remain composed. When they sat, the space between them felt different from the elevator, wider but no less charged, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to become noticeable before Lucas finally broke it, his gaze dropping briefly to Oliver before returning to her. "Your last name," he said, not as a question but as a statement waiting to be confirmed, and Emily felt the familiar instinct to guard herself rise again, subtle but firm. "Carter," she replied, her tone neutral, her posture steady, and Lucas nodded slowly, as though fitting a piece into a puzzle only he could see. "And his?" he asked, though they both already knew the answer, and Emily hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering again. "Bennett." And this time, the silence that followed was different, heavier, filled with something that could no longer be ignored. Lucas exhaled quietly, his gaze shifting toward the window for a brief moment. The city beyond reflected faintly in the glass. Before he looked back at her, his expression composed once more, but not untouched. "That is not a common coincidence," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent that made Emily's pulse quicken slightly. And she met his gaze, steady despite everything. "No," she agreed, softly, because somewhere beneath the uncertainty, beneath the questions neither of them had fully asked yet, there was a truth waiting, something that had already begun to surface the moment the elevator doors had opened, something that neither of them could pretend not to see anymore. Emily held his gaze for a second longer than she intended, then looked away first, because there was something about the way Lucas Bennett watched her that felt too close to something she had spent months carefully avoiding. Oliver shifted in her arms again, a soft, restless movement that brought her focus back to what mattered, and she adjusted the small blanket around him, smoothing it down with gentle, practiced hands as if the simple act could steady everything else that was beginning to feel uncertain. "It is just a name," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm, though even to herself it sounded thinner than she would have liked, and Lucas did not respond immediately, his eyes lingering on Oliver, on the tiny details most people would miss. The shape of his nose, the curve of his cheek, the faint hint of something familiar that was not easy to dismiss once seen. Names usually come from somewhere. He replied at last, his tone measured, not confrontational, but not willing to let the moment pass either, and Emily felt the weight of that settle between them, pressing gently but insistently. She exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the afternoon lights softened the edges of everything, as if the world outside had no idea what was unfolding inside this quiet corner. From his father, she said, choosing each word carefully, because there was a line she was not ready to cross. Not yet. And Lucas's expression shifted just slightly, the smallest tightening around his eyes, the kind that came from recognition rather than surprise. And where is he? Lucas asked, his voice still calm. But there was something beneath it now, something more personal, something that made the question feel less like curiosity and more like a step towards something neither of them could undo. Emily's fingers paused against Oliver's blanket, just for a second, before she continued the motion, smoothing it again as if nothing had changed. Not here, she answered simply, and for a moment, that was all there was. The quiet weight of those two words hanging in the air. Lucas leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture still composed but no longer distant, his attention fully anchored in the conversation now. That is not what I asked, he said, not harshly, not even firmly, just truthfully, and Emily met his gaze again, this time without looking away, because there was a point where retreat stopped being an option. It is the only answer I am giving, she replied, her voice steady. And for a brief second, something like respect flickered across Lucas's face, subtle but unmistakable, as if he recognized the boundary even as he considered how to move around it. Oliver let out a small, contented sigh, his breathing evening out as he settled more comfortably against her, completely unaware of the tension that seemed to shape the space around him. And Lucas's eyes softened again at the sound, the edge in his expression easing just enough to reveal something quieter, something that did not belong to boardrooms or decisions or power. He calmed down quickly, Lucas said, almost to himself, his gaze still on the baby, and Emily nodded faintly. He does that sometimes, she replied, though the truth was he did not. Not like that. Not with strangers. And the memory of how quickly Oliver had settled in Lucas's arms lingered in her mind longer than she wanted it to. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but filled with things left unsaid. And then Lucas spoke again, his tone shifting slightly, less direct, but no less intentional. How did you know this? Building? The question seemed simple on the surface, but Emily understood what he was really asking. How she had ended up in a place like this, how their paths had crossed at all, and she hesitated, just long enough to decide how much to reveal. I had an interview, she said finally, her eyes dropping briefly to Oliver before returning to him. A modeling agency upstairs, and there it was, the quiet truth she had not planned to share, the piece of herself that still felt uncertain, unfinished. Lucas studied her for a moment, taking in the details he had likely overlooked before, the way she carried herself, the natural grace that remained even beneath exhaustion. The kind of presence that did not disappear just because life had become harder, and he nodded slowly, as if that answered more than just the question. You were leaving, he said, recalling the moment before the elevator had stalled. And Emily gave a small, almost amused exhale, though there was no real humor in it. They said they would call, she replied, the familiar phrase landing with the same quiet disappointment it always carried, and Lucas's gaze sharpened slightly, not in judgment, but in understanding, because he had heard that sentence before, in different forms, in different contexts, always meaning the same thing. He leaned forward just a fraction, his elbows resting lightly against his knees, closing the distance again in a way that felt deliberate. What is the name of the agency? He asked, and Emily hesitated, instinctively wary of where that question might lead. It does not matter, she said, shaking her head slightly, because she did not want help. Not like that. Not from him. Not when everything already felt too complicated. Lucas held her gaze, steady, patient. It might. He replied, not pushing, not insisting, just stating a possibility, and Emily felt the familiar tension rise again. The pull between accepting something easier and holding on to the independence she had fought so hard to keep. Before she could answer, a voice approached from behind, the same man in the navy suit, careful, respectful, but more urgent now. "Sir, we are already running behind schedule," and Lucas did not look away from Emily as he responded. "Give me 5 minutes," his tone calm, but final, leaving no room for argument, and the man nodded, stepping back without another word. The world pressed in again, expectations, time, responsibilities, but for those few minutes, Lucas remained exactly where he was, his attention unwavering, and Emily realized then that whatever this was, whatever had started in that stalled elevator, it was no longer just about coincidence, it was about choices, about what they said next, about whether they allowed this moment to become something more or let it fade into something they would both pretend never happened. "Why did you really choose that name?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice softer now, almost careful, and Emily felt it, the question beneath the question, the one he had not asked directly, the one she had been avoiding since the moment he spoke Oliver's name out loud, and for a second, just a second, she considered telling him everything, letting the truth surface and settle wherever it might. But then Oliver stirred again, his small hand brushing against her collarbone, grounding her in the present, reminding her of everything that depended on her staying steady. "Because it felt right," she said instead, her voice gentle but closed, and Lucas watched her for a long moment, as if weighing the answer, as if deciding whether to accept it or challenge it. And in the end, he did neither. He simply nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging that some truths took longer to reveal than others, and that this was only the beginning. Lucas did not speak immediately after her answer, but the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It felt deliberate, as if he was choosing not to push, not because he had accepted her words, but because he had understood something deeper about her in the way she said them. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers resting protectively against Oliver's back, tracing small, absent patterns as she tried to steady the quiet tension building in her chest, because there was a difference between being questioned and being seen, and Lucas Bennett was doing the second in a way that felt far more dangerous. Beyond the glass, the city moved as it always did, cars sliding through traffic, people crossing streets, unaware that inside this quiet corner, two lives had just collided in a way neither of them could easily walk away from. "You do not trust me," Lucas said finally, his voice calm, not offended, not surprised, just stating what had already become clear, and Emily gave the smallest shake of her head, not in denial, but in correction. "I do not know you," she replied, her tone steady, her gaze holding his without hesitation, and something about that answer made the corner of his mouth shift almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, but something close to acknowledgement. "That is fair," he said, leaning back slightly, though his attention did not drift. If anything, it sharpened, focusing not just on her words, but on the spaces between them, the parts she chose not to say. Oliver stirred again, his small hand brushing against Emily's collarbone, and she instinctively leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead, the movement natural, unthinking, and Lucas watched it with a quiet stillness, as if witnessing something he had not allowed himself to notice in a very long time. "He has your eyes," Lucas said, the words slipping out before he seemed to fully consider them, and Emily froze for just a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that could be missed if someone was not looking closely. But Lucas noticed, of course he did, and something in his expression shifted again, not into certainty, but into something that felt dangerously close. Emily straightened slowly, her voice careful when she spoke. "A lot of babies have blue eyes," she replied, and Lucas did not argue, did not contradict, but the silence that followed made it clear he was not convinced. A faint vibration broke through the moment, Lucas's phone lighting up briefly on the table beside him, a reminder of everything waiting beyond this conversation, and he glanced at it only once before turning it face down, dismissing the interruption without a word, a choice that did not go unnoticed. Emily watched that small gesture, the quiet prioritization of this moment over whatever demanded his attention, and it unsettled her more than anything he had said so far. because it meant he was not going to let this go easily. "You should go," she said again, softer this time, not as dismissal, but as a kind of protection for him, for herself, for the fragile balance she had managed to maintain up until now. And Lucas exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting briefly toward the ceiling before returning to her, as if weighing something far larger than the situation itself. "I will," he said, though his tone suggested it was not the end of anything, only a pause, and Emily felt that in the way her chest tightened slightly, in the way her instincts told her this was far from over. He reached into his jacket then, retrieving a simple card, placing it gently on the table between them, the movement unhurried, deliberate. "If you decide you are ready to talk," he said, not pushing it toward her, not insisting she take it, just leaving it there as an option, and Emily's eyes dropped briefly to the card, her name not printed on it, of course, but his was, clean, understated, carrying a weight that did not need embellishment. She did not reach for it immediately, her fingers tightening slightly around Oliver instead, as if grounding herself in what mattered most. And Lucas watched her hesitation without comment, without pressure, understanding perhaps that forcing the moment would only push her further away. "You already know enough," she said quietly after a moment, her voice steady despite the quiet storm of thoughts behind it. And Lucas shook his head once, not in disagreement, but in quiet certainty. "No," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "I know just enough to understand that I do not know anything at all." And there it was again, that honesty that did not belong to the version of him the world saw, the one that dealt in decisions and outcomes and control. Emily finally reached for the card then, her fingers brushing its surface lightly before picking it up, as if testing its weight, and she slipped it into her coat pocket without looking at it again, a small gesture that carried more meaning than she intended to show. Lucas stood after that, the movement smooth, composed, the presence of the so, returning in the way his posture straightened, in the way the distance between them subtly reformed, but not completely, not like before. "Take care of him," he said, his voice softer now, directed not just at Emily, but at Oliver, and Emily nodded once, her expression calm, though something in her eyes had shifted, something quieter, more uncertain. He turned then, stepping back into the flow of the building, the staff around him immediately adjusting, falling into step, the world reclaiming him as if he had only briefly stepped out of it. And Emily remained where she was, watching until he disappeared beyond the glass doors, until the space he had occupied felt empty again, though not truly empty, not anymore. Oliver let out a soft, sleepy sound, and Emily looked down at him, her fingers brushing gently over his hair, grounding herself once more in the present, in what she could control. But even as she stood, even as she turned toward the exit, her mind did not settle, because something had changed, something irreversible. And as she stepped out into the late afternoon light, the city air cooler against her skin, she knew with a quiet certainty that this was not the end of their story. It was only the moment where it truly began. The air outside felt different, cooler, wider, but Emily Carter did not breathe easier as she stepped onto the pavement, because some moments did not end when you walked away from them. They followed you, quiet and persistent, settling somewhere beneath your thoughts where they refused to be ignored. Oliver shifted gently against her shoulder, his warmth grounding her in something real, something simple, and she adjusted the strap of her worn bag before starting down the street, her steps steady, deliberate, as if moving forward would somehow untangle everything that had just happened. Traffic hummed in the distance, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the buildings. And for anyone passing by, she was just another young mother heading home, unnoticed, unremarkable. But inside, something had shifted in a way she could not name. Her fingers brushed unconsciously against the pocket of her coat where the card rested, a small, flat reminder of a man who did not belong in her life, a man she had not expected to see again. And yet, he had looked at Oliver in a way that made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something far more complicated. She stopped briefly at a pedestrian crossing, waiting for the light to change, and her gaze drifted across the street without really seeing anything, her mind replaying fragments of the elevator, the quiet calm in his voice, the way Oliver had settled so easily in his arms, the question he had asked without fully asking it. The signal changed, and she moved with the crowd, her steps falling into rhythm with everyone else. But her thoughts refused to follow. By the time she reached the bus stop, the sky had begun to soften into early evening, a pale wash of light fading behind the buildings, and she lowered herself onto the bench carefully, shifting Oliver into a more comfortable position as he slept, his small breaths even, peaceful, completely untouched by the weight she carried. The bus arrived with a low hiss of air, and Emily stood, stepping on board with a quiet nod to the driver, her movements automatic, practiced, as she made her way to a seat near the window. The ride was familiar, a series of stops and turns she could navigate with her eyes closed. And yet today, everything felt slightly off, as if the world had tilted just enough to make her notice it. She sat by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, watching as the city moved past in a blur of lights and motion. And for the first time since leaving the building, she allowed herself to think about what Lucas Bennett had said, not the words themselves, but the way he had said them, the certainty beneath the calm, the quiet insistence that this was not over. Oliver stirred softly, his tiny hand curling against her coat, and she looked down at him, her expression softening despite everything. "It is just us," she whispered, more to herself than to him, a quiet reassurance she had repeated countless times before, because it had always been true, because it had to remain true. The bus slowed as it approached her stop, and she stood, adjusting her hold on Oliver before stepping down onto the pavement. The air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of evening settling in. Her apartment was not far, just a short walk down a narrow street lined with modest buildings. The kind of place where people minded their own business, where lives unfolded quietly behind closed doors. She reached the front door, pushing it open with her shoulder, and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her feet grounding her in something steady, something unchanged. The small space greeted her exactly as she had left it, simple, tidy, everything in its place, because order was something she could control, something she relied on when everything else felt uncertain. She moved to the couch, lowering herself carefully, Oliver still asleep against her, and for a moment, she simply sat there, the silence wrapping around her, the weight of the day settling slowly into her bones. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket, almost without thinking, her fingers closing around the card, and she pulled it out, turning it over in her hand, the clean, understated design reflecting the soft light from the lamp beside her. Lucas Bennett. The name felt heavier now, no longer just a title, but something connected to her in a way she had not planned, not wanted, and yet could not ignore. She stared at it for a long moment, her thoughts quiet but restless, before placing it gently on the table in front of her, as if setting it down might also set aside the questions that came with it. Oliver shifted again, letting out a soft, sleepy sound, and she leaned down, pressing a light kiss to his forehead, her fingers brushing through his fine hair, grounding herself once more in what mattered most. "We are fine," she whispered, her voice calm, steady, even as something deep inside her knew that fine did not mean the same thing anymore. Across the city, in a building of glass and steel, Lucas Bennett stood by a window that stretched from floor to ceiling, his reflection faint against the darkening skyline, his phone resting untouched on the desk behind him as the world waited for his attention, meetings delayed, decisions postponed, all of it held at a distance for reasons he had not yet fully explained, even to himself. His mind returned again and again to the same image, a young woman in a dimly lit elevator, holding a child who had his name, his eyes, and a presence that felt far too familiar to dismiss as coincidence. He exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting toward the city below, the lights beginning to flicker on one by one. And for the first time in a long time, something unsettled moved beneath his usual certainty, something that did not fit into numbers or strategies or controlled outcomes. He reached for his phone at last, his fingers pausing briefly before making a single call, his voice calm, precise when the line connected. "I need you to find someone," he said, and as he spoke the name, as he repeated it with quiet clarity, the distance between two separate lives began to close in ways neither of them could stop anymore. The night settled quietly around Emily's small apartment, the kind of quiet that usually brought her comfort, but tonight it carried something heavier, something that lingered in the stillness between sounds. Oliver lay asleep in his cot beside the couch, his soft breathing the only steady rhythm in the room, and Emily sat nearby, her arms folded loosely as her eyes drifted again and again toward the card resting on the table, as if it might change if she looked at it long enough. She had not picked it up again, not since placing it there, but its presence filled the room in a way that felt impossible to ignore, a silent question waiting for an answer she was not ready to give. She leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, her gaze shifting to the window where the faint glow of streetlights painted soft reflections across the glass. And for a moment, she allowed herself to remember, not the elevator, not the conversation, but something older, something she had carefully buried beneath. Months of routine and responsibility. It had been a different day, a different version of her, standing in a place far removed from the life she lived now, where everything had seemed possible, where the future had not yet narrowed into something so fragile. She closed her eyes briefly, the memory passing like a quiet shadow, not fully formed, not fully gone. And when she opened them again, she reached for the card almost without thinking. Her fingers traced the edge of it slowly, the smooth surface cool beneath her touch, and she turned it over once more. Lucas Bennett's name steady, unchanged, as if it had always been there, waiting to intersect with her life again. "No," she whispered softly, shaking her head, as if the simple denial could undo the connection that had already begun, and she set the card down again, this time a little further away, as if distance might make a difference. Oliver stirred lightly in his sleep, a soft sound escaping him, and Emily stood immediately, moving to his side with quiet instinct, her hand resting gently against his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "It is just us," she murmured again, the words softer now, less certain, and for a moment, she stayed there, grounded by his presence, by the simple truth of what she had built on her own. Across the city, the night stretched differently inside Lucas Bennett's office, where the lights remained on long after the rest of the building had settled into silence. He stood near his desk, a file open in front of him, though he had not turned a page in several minutes. His attention caught somewhere between what he knew and what he had just begun to suspect. The name stared back at him from the screen, Emily Carter. The details beneath it sparse, but enough to confirm that she existed exactly as she had presented herself, a quiet life, a modest address, no connections to the world he operated in, and yet none of it explained what he had seen, what he had felt in that elevator, the unmistakable pull of something that did not align with coincidence. He moved slowly, circling the desk, his hand brushing lightly against the back of the chair as he considered the fragments of information laid out before him. The dates, the timeline, the small details that began to form a pattern the more he looked at them. 6 months, the number echoed in his mind, aligning too closely with a point in his own past he had not revisited in a long time. A moment that had seemed fleeting then, insignificant in the grand scope of his life, and yet now it returned with quiet insistence, demanding to be acknowledged. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he stepped toward the window, the city lights stretching endlessly before him, each one representing a life, a story, a choice, and somewhere within all of that, one story had found its way back to him. His phone vibrated softly against the desk, and he turned, picking it up. Without hesitation, his voice calm when he answered, "Yes," and the response came quickly, efficient, precise, confirming what he had already begun to piece together, not with certainty, but with enough weight to shift everything. Lucas closed his eyes briefly, the information settling into place, and when he opened them again, there was a clarity in his expression that had not been there before, a decision forming not out of impulse, but out of something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. "I want everything," he said, his tone steady, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Timeline, background, anything that connects her to me." And when the line went quiet, when the task was set in motion, he remained still for a moment longer, his gaze returning to the city beyond the glass, as if searching for something within it. Back in her apartment, Emily had finally settled onto the couch again, exhaustion beginning to pull at her in quiet waves, but her mind refused to rest. Circling back to the same point, the same question she had not allowed herself to fully ask. She reached for her phone this time, her fingers hovering over the screen, the urge to look him up, to confirm what she already knew, flickering briefly before she locked the screen again, placing it beside her without acting on it. Some things, once confirmed, could not be undone, and she was not ready for that. Not yet. The room remained quiet, the night deepening outside, and for a moment, it felt as though nothing had changed, as though tomorrow would come and everything would return to the way it had been. But beneath that fragile illusion, something else moved, something steady and inevitable, drawing two separate lives closer with each passing hour. And as Emily finally closed her eyes, her last thought was not of fear, but of the way he had looked at Oliver, as if seeing something that belonged to him. And across the city, Lucas Bennett stood in the glow of the skyline, fully awake, fully aware that whatever this was, it had already begun, and neither of them could turn away from it now. Morning did not bring clarity. It brought routine, and Emily held onto that routine like something solid as sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft lines across the small apartment where everything still looked the same, even though nothing felt the same anymore. Oliver stirred first, a quiet sound that pulled her gently from sleep, and she was already moving before she was fully awake, lifting him carefully, pressing her cheek against his soft hair as if anchoring herself in something certain. The world outside continued without pause, traffic beginning its steady hum, distant voices rising and falling, and Emily moved through her morning with practiced ease, preparing a bottle, checking his blanket, adjusting the small details that made up their life, because those details were hers. They were earned, built slowly, and she was not ready to let anything disrupt them. The card remained on the table where she had left it, catching the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore, but she did not touch it. Not yet. Not while the morning still belonged to her and Oliver alone. Across the city, Lucas Bennett had not slept much, the night folding into morning without offering rest, and he stood in his office once again, though the sunlight now replaced the city lights, illuminating the file laid out before him with a clarity that felt almost intrusive. The information was no longer scattered. It had been gathered, arranged, confirmed, and the timeline sat in front of him with quiet precision, each detail aligning too closely to dismiss. He read it again, slowly, not because he did not understand it, but because he needed to feel it settle into something real. 6 months, a date, a location, a name, Emily Carter, and the absence of anything that contradicted what he had begun to suspect. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because this was not a situation he could approach like any other, not with distance, not with strategy alone. His phone rang once, a reminder of the day waiting to begin, and he answered it briefly, his voice calm, efficient, giving instructions that would keep everything moving without him needing to think about it, because for once, his attention was not divided. It was focused entirely on something he had not planned for. "Clear my afternoon," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation, and when the line ended, he reached for his jacket, the decision already made before he had fully acknowledged it. Back in the apartment, Emily had dressed simply, the same careful balance between practicality and the quiet remnants of who she used to be, her movements steady as she prepared to leave, because staying inside would not change anything, and stepping outside at least gave the illusion of moving forward. Oliver rested comfortably against her, his small hand curled lightly against her collarbone, and she glanced once more at the table before turning away, leaving the card exactly where it was, as if not taking it meant something, as if it created a boundary she could still control. The street greeted her with the same familiar rhythm, people moving, shops opening, the ordinary flow of life continuing uninterrupted, and she stepped into it without hesitation, blending into the quiet anonymity she had relied on for so long. The park was only a short walk away, a small patch of green surrounded by buildings, where the air felt a little lighter, where mothers sat on benches and children played in soft, scattered laughter, and Emily found a place near the edge, lowering herself carefully, letting Oliver rest more comfortably as she watched the world move around her. For a while, nothing happened, nothing unusual, just the steady passage of time, and she let herself relax into it, just enough to forget, just enough to breathe. But some moments did not wait for permission. They arrived exactly when they were meant to, and she felt it before she saw it, that quiet shift in the air, the subtle awareness that something had changed. She looked up slowly, her gaze moving across the path until it settled on a figure approaching from the far side of the park. Tall, composed, unmistakable even at a distance, and her breath caught before she could stop it, because she had known, somewhere beneath everything else, that this would not end with a single conversation. Lucas Bennett did not hurry, his steps measured, his presence drawing quiet attention without effort, and as he reached her, the distance between their worlds closed again, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet inevitability that had started it all. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space, giving her the choice to stand or remain seated, and Emily stayed where she was, her hand instinctively adjusting around Oliver, her posture steady even as her pulse quickened. "You did not call," he said, not accusing, not disappointed, just stating a fact, and Emily met his gaze, her expression calm despite the sudden return of everything she had tried to set aside. "I was not going to," she replied honestly, because there was no point pretending otherwise, and Lucas nodded once, as if he had expected that answer, as if it changed nothing about why he was there. He glanced briefly at Oliver, who had begun to stir, his small movements drawing his attention immediately, and something softened again in his expression, something that did not belong to the man who ran an empire, but to someone standing in a park, looking at a child who might be his. "I have the answers," Lucas said quietly, his voice lower now, more personal, and Emily felt the weight of those words settle into her chest, not as a shock, but as something she had been preparing for without admitting it. She looked down at Oliver for a moment, her fingers brushing gently against his back, grounding herself, before lifting her gaze back to Lucas, steady, unwavering. "So do I," she said softly, and in that moment, the space between them shifted again, not with uncertainty, but with the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be about coincidence anymore. It would be about truth, and neither of them could step away from that now. The moment did not explode into answers. It settled into something quieter, heavier, as if the truth between them had weight and needed time to land properly. Emily held Lucas's gaze without looking away this time, her posture still, grounded, Oliver resting against her as though nothing in the world had changed, though everything had. The breeze moved gently through the park, lifting strands of her blonde hair, carrying the distant laughter of children and the soft rhythm of life continuing around them. Unaware of what stood at the center of it all, Lucas took a slow breath, his hands relaxed at his sides, but there was nothing casual in the way he stood there, every part of him focused, present, as if this moment mattered more than anything waiting elsewhere. "Then we should stop pretending," he said quietly, his voice calm but direct, and Emily felt that land deeper than any accusation could have, because it was not harsh, it was honest. She looked down at Oliver for a brief second, her fingers brushing lightly across his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, before lifting her eyes back to Lucas. "You already know," she said softly, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement, and Lucas nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something that had been building long before this conversation. "I know the timeline," he replied, his tone measured, careful. "I know where you were, and where I was." And there was no arrogance in his words, only certainty, the kind that came from facts he had already verified. Emily exhaled quietly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, not because the situation had become easier, but because the space for denial had finally disappeared. "Then you also know I did not plan any of this," she said, her voice steady, and Lucas's gaze softened just a fraction, the edge of calculation giving way to something more human. "I never thought you did," he answered, and that was the truth, simple and unguarded. And it shifted something between them again, removing the last trace of suspicion that could have made this confrontation something harsher. Oliver stirred in that moment, his eyes fluttering open, blinking softly against the daylight, and for a second, the world narrowed to something small and immediate, his quiet curiosity, the way his tiny hand reached out without understanding anything beyond the need to connect. Lucas noticed it instantly, his attention drawn in a way that felt instinctive, and without thinking, He lowered himself slightly, closing the distance just enough to be closer. Not imposing, not assuming, just present. Oliver's hand brushed lightly against the edge of Lucas's jacket, fingers curling with that same natural grip that had stilled him in the elevator. And Lucas froze for the smallest fraction of a second, something unspoken passing through his expression before it softened again, deeper this time, less guarded. Emily watched that moment carefully, her breath slowing as she observed not just his reaction, but the absence of hesitation in it. The quiet acceptance that did not need explanation. "He does that," she said softly. Though there was something more behind her words now, something less defensive, more open. Lucas nodded faintly, his gaze still on Oliver. "He trusts easily," he replied, and there was a note of something reflective in his voice, as if he was measuring that trust against something within himself. Emily shifted slightly, adjusting Oliver so he was more comfortable, but she did not pull him away, did not break the small connection that had formed so naturally, and Lucas seemed to understand that. Without needing it explained, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with things both of them were processing, weighing, accepting in pieces rather than all at once. Finally, Lucas straightened again, his expression composed, though not distant, not like before. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, the question gentle, but unavoidable now. And Emily did not answer immediately, because the truth was not simple. It was layered, built from choices she had made when the future had looked very different. She looked out across the park briefly, watching a child chase a ball across the grass, the simple, uncomplicated joy of it standing in quiet contrast to the complexity of her own situation. "Because I did not know if I should," she said at last, her voice calm, not defensive, just honest. "And then, I did not know how." And Lucas listened without interrupting, his attention steady, as if every word mattered. "You had a life," she continued softly, her eyes returning to him. "A world that does not leave room for this." She gestured lightly toward Oliver, toward herself, not dismissively, but realistically, and Lucas's expression shifted again, something firm settling beneath the calm. "You do not get to decide what my life has room for," he said, not sharply, but with a quiet authority. That did not feel like control, it felt like truth, and Emily held his gaze, not intimidated, but considering, because part of her understood that, even if she had never allowed herself to believe it before. Oliver let out a soft sound, drawing both of their attention back to him, and for a moment, that was all that mattered again. The simple presence of a child who had brought two separate lives into alignment. The park continued around them, unchanged, the world unaware, but for Emily and Lucas, something had shifted permanently, something that would not return to what it had been before. "What happens now?" Emily asked quietly, not out of fear, but out of necessity, because knowing the truth was only the beginning, not the resolution. Lucas looked at her, then at Oliver, then back at her again, his expression steady, resolved in a way that left little room for doubt. "Now we do this properly," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the words feel like more than a statement. They felt like a promise. And in that moment, standing in the middle of an ordinary park under an ordinary sky, Emily realized that whatever came next would not be simple, but it would be real, and for the first time since everything began, she did not look away. Emily did not answer right away, because the word properly lingered in the air between them, heavier than it sounded, filled with meanings that stretched far beyond what either of them had said out loud. And she looked at Lucas carefully, searching not for confidence, but for understanding, because promises were easy to make when the moment demanded them, but much harder to carry when reality settled in. Oliver shifted again in her arms, his small fingers brushing lightly against her sleeve, grounding her in something steady, something that did not change regardless of what came next, and she adjusted him gently, her movements calm even as her thoughts moved quickly beneath the surface. "Properly means different things to different people," she said at last, her voice quiet but clear, not challenging him, but not simply accepting his words either. And Lucas inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the point without stepping away from his own. "Then we define it," he replied, his tone even, the kind of certainty that came from someone used to shaping outcomes rather than waiting for them. and Emily felt that familiar tension rise again, not from fear, but from the instinct to protect what she had built, because defining something with him meant opening a door she had kept closed. For a reason, the breeze shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of grass and distant water, and for a moment, the park seemed quieter, as if the world itself had softened to allow this conversation to unfold without interruption. "You have your world," Emily said, her eyes steady on his, "and I have mine." And there was no bitterness in her tone, only truth. A simple statement of reality that had shaped every decision she had made since Oliver was born. Lucas did not deny it, did not dismiss it, but he did not accept it as a boundary either. "Worlds change," he said calmly, and Emily gave a small shake of her head, not in disagreement, but in experience. "Not like that," she replied softly, because she knew how difficult it was to shift even the smallest part of a life, let alone something as vast as his. Oliver made a small sound, drawing both of their attention again, and Lucas watched him with a focus that felt instinctive, not calculated, and Emily noticed that, the way his attention returned again and again to the child, not out of obligation, but something quieter, something more natural than she had expected. "He needs stability," she added, her voice softer now, not defensive, but protective, and Lucas nodded once, understanding the weight of that word even if their definitions of it might differ. "So do I," he said, and for a moment, that answer caught her off guard, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, without pretense, without the distance she might have expected from someone like him. Emily studied him for a second longer, then looked down at Oliver, her fingers brushing lightly over his back as she considered everything that had led them here, every choice, every silence, every moment she had believed she was doing what was best. "You are asking for something that changes everything," she said quietly, and Lucas did not hesitate this time. "It already has," he replied, and there was no argument in his voice, only fact, something she could not easily deny. The park continued around them, people passing by without noticing, the world moving in its usual rhythm, and Emily realized that for everyone else, this was just another day, another conversation, but for them, it marked a shift that could not be undone. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not in surrender, but in acceptance of the moment as it was. "What do you want?" she asked, not because she did not understand, but because she needed to hear him say it, clearly, without ambiguity. Lucas met her gaze, his expression steady, unflinching. "I want to be part of his life," he said, his voice calm but firm, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Emily felt that land deep within her, not as a shock, but as something she had anticipated and resisted at the same time, and she looked down at Oliver again, her thumb tracing a small, absent circle against his back as she considered what that would mean, not just for her, but for him. "It is not just your decision," she said after a moment, her voice gentle but resolute, and Lucas nodded. "I know," he replied, and there was no frustration in it, no impatience, only a quiet acknowledgement of the reality they both faced. A child laughed somewhere behind them, a bright, uncomplicated sound that cut through the heaviness of the moment. And Emily found herself watching that direction briefly, as if reminding herself what this was all about, what mattered beyond everything else. When she looked back at Lucas, her expression had softened, not in certainty, but in openness. "We take it slowly," she said, choosing her words carefully. "No sudden changes, no expectations." And Lucas listened without interrupting, his focus unwavering. "He comes first," she added, her voice steady, and Lucas inclined his head once more. "Agreed," he said, and this time, the word felt like more than agreement. It felt like a foundation, something they could build on, even if they did not yet know what that would look like. Oliver shifted again, his eyes opening briefly, blinking up at the light before settling once more, and Lucas watched that small movement with quiet attention, as if committing it to memory, as if each moment mattered in a way he had not anticipated. Emily noticed that too, the way his presence had changed, not just in words, but in the details, the way he stood, the way he looked at Oliver, the way he remained instead of stepping away. "There is a cafe across the street," Lucas said after a moment, his tone lighter, but still grounded in the same steady intention. "We can talk there, somewhere warmer." And Emily followed his gaze briefly, considering the simple suggestion, the normalcy of it. Something so ordinary it felt almost unfamiliar in the context of everything else. She hesitated for just a second, then nodded, a small, deliberate movement that carried more meaning than it seemed, and as she stood, adjusting Oliver carefully against her shoulder, she realized that this was not just about answers anymore. It was about what came after them, the quiet, uncertain path forward that neither of them could fully see yet, but both had chosen to step onto anyway. The cafe was small, tucked just beyond the edge of the park as if it had always existed there quietly, unnoticed by the rush of the city, and as Emily stepped inside, the warm air wrapped around her, carrying the soft scent of coffee and something freshly baked, grounding her in a space that felt almost too ordinary for what they were about. To navigate, Lucas followed a step behind, his presence still composed, but less imposing in this setting, as though the simplicity of the place had stripped away some of the distance that usually surrounded him, and he paused briefly to hold the door as Emily moved ahead, a small gesture that did not go unnoticed. They chose a table near the window, where the light filtered in gently, and Emily lowered herself into the chair carefully, adjusting Oliver in her arms until he settled again, his quiet breathing a steady reminder of what anchored every decision she would make. Lucas took the seat across from her, his posture relaxed but attentive, his focus never straying far from Oliver. Even as a waitress approached, her tone polite, unaware of the weight carried in the silence between them. They ordered simply, Emily asking for a tea, Lucas for a black coffee, and when the waitress stepped away, the quiet returned. But it was different now, less uncertain, more deliberate, as if both of them understood that this was where things would begin to take shape. "Tell me what his days look like," Lucas said, not as a demand, but as an entry point, his voice steady, and Emily blinked slightly, the question unexpected in its simplicity, because she had prepared herself for something more direct, more difficult, and yet this felt more intimate in a way she had not anticipated. She adjusted Oliver slightly, her gaze softening as she looked down at him. "He wakes early," she began, quietly, her voice settling into a rhythm that felt natural. "Usually just after 6, sometimes earlier." And Lucas listened without interruption, his attention steady, absorbing not just the words, but the way she spoke them, the quiet familiarity, the care woven into every detail. "He likes the window," she continued, a faint smile touching her lips without her noticing. "The light keeps him calm." And Lucas's gaze shifted briefly toward the window beside them, as if picturing it, as if placing Oliver into that small, quiet moment he had not been part of. "And you?" he asked after a moment, his voice softer now, and Emily hesitated, just slightly, because that question reached beyond routine, beyond structure, into something more personal. "I work when I can," she replied simply, not elaborating, not offering more than necessary, and Lucas did not push, did not press for details, though something in his expression suggested he had already begun to understand the gaps between what she said and what she did not. Their drinks arrived, the soft clink of porcelain against the table breaking the moment briefly, and Emily wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat settle into her palms, grounding herself again, while Lucas took a small sip of his coffee, his gaze still returning, again and again, to Oliver. "You said we take it slowly," he said after a moment, his tone calm. "What does that look like to you?" And Emily met his eyes, appreciating the directness of the question, the way he did not assume, did not impose, but asked. She considered it carefully, because this was where it mattered, where words would begin to shape reality. "It means you do not walk into his life and change everything overnight," she said, her voice steady. "No sudden routines, no overwhelming him." And Lucas nodded once, understanding the importance of that without needing it explained further. "It means consistency," she added, her gaze steady. "If you are there properly, not when it suits you." And there was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. And Lucas accepted it without hesitation. "Agreed," he said, his voice firm, and something about the way he said it made her believe him, not because of who he was, but because of how he had chosen to be in this moment. Oliver stirred slightly then, his eyes opening just enough to take in the unfamiliar surroundings, and Emily adjusted him instinctively. But before she could fully settle him, Lucas leaned forward just slightly, his movement careful, unintrusive. "May I?" he asked, the same question as before, and Emily paused, her instinct to protect still present, but softer now, tempered by everything that had already passed between them. She hesitated for a brief second, then nodded, and Lucas reached out, his hands steady as he took Oliver gently, supporting him with a familiarity that felt both surprising and natural. Oliver blinked up at him, his small expression curious rather than unsettled, and for a moment, the noise of the cafe faded into something distant, leaving only the quiet connection between them. Lucas adjusted his hold slightly, his gaze softening in a way that did not belong to the version of him the world knew, and Emily watched that closely, her breath slowing as she took in the details. The absence of awkwardness, the quiet ease that suggested this was not entirely new to him. Even if the situation was, he knows, Lucas said quietly, almost to himself, and Emily's eyes lifted to meet his, a question forming before she could stop it. "Knows what?" she asked softly, and Lucas looked at her then, something thoughtful in his expression. "When someone belongs," he replied, not as a claim, not as a certainty, but as a feeling he could not fully explain. And Emily felt that settle into her chest in a way that was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. She looked down at her tea, the surface still, reflecting the soft light from the window, and for a moment, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that this might not be as impossible as she had believed, that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that did not take everything away, but added something she had not expected. Outside, the world continued, cars passing, people moving, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside the small cafe. And as Emily looked back up, meeting Lucas's gaze once more, she realized that this was no longer about whether their lives would intersect. It was about how they would choose to shape what came next, together, slowly, one moment at a time. Emily watched the way Oliver rested in Lucas's arms, not with tension, not with uncertainty, but with a quiet ease that made something shift inside her again. Something she had been holding tightly without realizing it. And for a moment, she did not speak, allowing the silence to settle into something softer, something that did not need to be filled immediately. The cafe moved around them in its usual rhythm, cups clinking, low conversations weaving in and out, but at their table, time seemed to slow just enough for each detail to matter, for each small movement to carry weight. Lucas adjusted his hold slightly, supporting Oliver with a natural steadiness that came without effort, and his gaze remained gentle, attentive, as if this moment was not something he was observing, but something he was part of, something he had already begun to accept. "He is lighter than I expected," Lucas said quietly, a faint note of wonder beneath the calm, and Emily allowed a small, almost hesitant, smile to touch her lips. "He will not be for long," she replied softly, the hint of warmth in her voice surprising even herself. Lucas glanced up at her then, and there was something different in his expression, less guarded, less controlled, as if the space between them had shifted in a way that allowed something more genuine to surface. "You have done this alone," he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. And Emily met his gaze steadily, not looking away, because there was no reason to hide that truth. "Yes," she answered simply, and there was no pride in it, no complaint, just fact, something she had carried without expecting anyone else to understand. Lucas nodded once, slowly, as if taking that in, not just hearing it, but recognizing what it meant beneath the surface, the long nights, the quiet decisions, the constant balancing of what was needed and what was possible. "You should not have had to," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, carrying something that felt closer to regret than anything else, and Emily felt that settle in her chest in a way she had not expected. She looked down at her tea briefly, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. "That was not your decision to make," she replied gently, not as a rejection, but as a reminder of the path she had chosen, the reasons behind it. Lucas did not argue, did not correct her, but something in his expression suggested that the conversation was no longer about what had been done, but what would be done next. Oliver stirred again, his small hand curling lightly against Lucas's shirt, and Lucas stilled for a moment, his breath slowing as if he was matching the rhythm of the child in his arms. And Emily noticed that, the quiet adjustment, the instinctive way he responded without thinking. "He likes you," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and Lucas looked at Oliver again, his expression thoughtful. "I like him," he replied, and there was something in the simplicity of that answer that made it feel more real than anything more elaborate could have been. The waitress passed by again, offering a brief smile, unaware of the quiet significance unfolding at the table, and Emily took a small sip of her tea, the warmth grounding her, steadying the thoughts that continued to shift beneath the surface. "There is something you need to understand," she said after a moment, her voice calm, but more serious now, and Lucas's attention returned to her immediately, unwavering. "This is not about proving anything," she continued, her gaze steady. "Not about stepping in and taking over." And Lucas nodded once, not interrupting, allowing her to finish. "He does not need a perfect life," she added softly. "He needs a real one." And Lucas held her gaze for a long moment, something firm settling in his expression, something that felt like agreement, but deeper, more considered. "Then that is what he will have," he said quietly, and Emily studied him carefully, because words like that could mean many things, could be shaped by intention or by expectation, and she needed to know which this was. Oliver shifted again, his eyes opening more fully this time, blinking up at Lucas with quiet curiosity, and for a brief second, everything else seemed to fall away, leaving only that connection, simple and unforced. Lucas's expression softened further, the edges of his usual composure easing into something more open, and Emily felt something in her chest loosen just slightly, not fully, not completely, but enough to allow a different kind of possibility to exist. "What about your world?" she asked then, the question quiet but necessary, because everything they were discussing existed within the context of something much larger, something neither of them could ignore. Lucas did not look away, did not hesitate. "It will adjust," he said, his tone steady. And Emily gave a faint shake of her head, not dismissing him, but grounding the conversation again. "It is not that simple," she replied, and Lucas acknowledged that with a small nod. "No," he agreed, "but it is possible." And there was a quiet certainty in his voice that made it difficult to argue, not because it was absolute, but because it was intentional. The cafe continued around them, the world unchanged, but at their table, something had shifted again, something subtle but important, the distance between them narrowing not through words alone, but through the quiet understanding that had begun to form. Emily looked at Oliver, then back at Lucas, her expression thoughtful, measured, and for the first time since this had begun, there was less resistance in her gaze, less need to hold everything at a distance. "We will see," she said softly, not as doubt, but as acceptance of the path ahead. And Lucas inclined his head once, understanding that this was not a conclusion, but a beginning. Oliver let out a small, contented sound, settling more comfortably, and Lucas adjusted his hold instinctively, his movements calm, steady, as if he had already begun to find his place in this new reality. And as Emily watched that, really watched it, she realized that what had started as an interruption, a moment out of place, had become something else entirely, something that would not fade when they walked away, something that would follow them into whatever came next, quietly, steadily, shaping everything in ways neither of them could fully predict yet. The conversation did not end when the words ran out. It lingered in the quiet space between them, in the way Emily watched Lucas hold Oliver as if it already mattered, and in the way Lucas did not rush to return him, as if time itself had slowed just enough to let something fragile take shape. Outside the cafe window, the afternoon had begun to shift toward evening, the lights softening into a warmer glow that stretched across the street, and inside, the world continued in small, ordinary motions that felt distant compared to what was unfolding at their table. Emily's fingers rested lightly around her cup, though the tea had long gone untouched, her attention no longer divided, no longer guarded in the same way it had been when he first sat down, because something had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a quiet decision forming without needing to be spoken. Lucas glanced up from Oliver then, meeting her eyes, and for a moment, neither of them looked away, the silence no longer uncertain, but filled with an understanding that did not require explanation. There are things I will need to adjust, Lucas said after a moment, his voice calm, not as a promise, but as a statement of fact, and Emily studied him carefully, because she had learned not to rely on words alone, not without seeing what stood behind them. That is your responsibility, she replied gently, her tone not dismissive, but grounded, and Lucas nodded once, accepting that without resistance, because this was not something he could delegate, not something he could solve with distance. Oliver shifted again, a small sound escaping him as his eyes drifted closed once more, his body relaxing completely in Lucas's arms, and Emily noticed the way Lucas adjusted instinctively, the quiet precision in the movement, as if he had already begun to learn without being taught. He trusts you, she said softly, more to herself than to him, and Lucas looked down at Oliver again, something thoughtful passing through his expression. Then I will not give him a reason not to, he replied, and there was a quiet weight too. Those words that made them feel less like intention and more like commitment. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture easing in a way it had not before, because part of her, the part that had been braced for resistance or complication, had begun to understand that this might not unfold the way she had feared. You cannot control everything, she said after a moment, her voice calm, not challenging, but reminding. And Lucas allowed the faintest trace of a smile to touch his expression, not because he disagreed, but because he recognized the truth in it. No, he said quietly, but I can choose what matters, and Emily held his gaze for a second longer, considering that, because choice was something she understood deeply, something she had relied on when there had been no other options. The waitress returned briefly, clearing the table with a polite nod, and Emily shifted slightly, preparing to stand, the moment stretching towards something new, something beyond the safe boundary of conversation. I should go, she said softly, her voice steady, and Lucas nodded, though he did not move immediately, his attention still anchored to Oliver, as if letting go required a decision he was not quite ready to make. Emily stood slowly, adjusting her coat, her movements calm, deliberate, and when Lucas finally rose as well, he stepped closer, careful, measured, returning Oliver with the same quiet attention he had shown from the beginning. Their hands brushed briefly as the child settled back against her, and Emily felt it again, that subtle shift, not something she could name, but something she could not ignore. I will call, Lucas said, not as a question, not seeking permission, but offering continuity, and Emily met his eyes, her expression thoughtful, not resistant, not fully open, but somewhere in between. We will see, she replied softly, though this time, there was less distance in her voice, less need to keep everything at arm's length. Oliver stirred slightly, his head resting against her shoulder, and she adjusted him instinctively, her focus returning to the simple, steady rhythm of caring for him, the world narrowing again to what she knew, what she could hold on to. Lucas stepped back then, just enough to give her space, but not enough to break the connection entirely, and for a moment, they stood there, neither speaking, neither moving, as if both understood that this was not an ending, only a pause. Outside, the light had shifted further, the sky softening into the first hints of evening, and Emily turned toward the door, her steps measured, steady, not hurried, because walking away did not feel the same as it had before. She reached the threshold, then paused briefly, just for a second, before glancing back, and Lucas was still there, exactly where she had left him, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, and in that moment, something settled quietly inside her. Not certainty, not resolution, but something close to acceptance. She stepped outside, the cool air meeting her again, and this time, it did not feel like distance, it felt like space, like something opening rather than closing. Behind her, Lucas remained in the cafe for a moment longer, watching as the door closed, as the reflection of her figure faded into the glass, and when he finally turned away, there was a clarity in his expression that had not been there before, a direction that did not rely on assumption or hesitation. He reached for his phone, not with urgency, but with purpose, And as he stepped back into his world, into the structure and movement that defined everything else, one thing remained unchanged, one thing that now stood at the center of it all, steady and undeniable. Some encounters were accidents, brief interruptions that faded with time, but others carried something more, something that did not disappear when the moment ended, something that stayed, shaping what came next in ways neither of them had expected. And as Emily walked home with Oliver resting quietly against her, she realized that this was not about what had happened. It was about what would follow, the quiet unfolding of something neither of them could fully control, but both had already begun to choose. The evening settled gently over the city, the sky fading into soft hues of blue and amber as Emily walked the familiar path back to her apartment, Oliver resting quietly against her shoulder, his steady breathing a quiet anchor in a world that had shifted in ways she was only beginning to understand. The streets were calmer now, the rush of the day easing into something slower, more reflective, and Emily found herself matching that rhythm, her steps unhurried, her thoughts no longer racing, but unfolding one at a time, each one carrying the weight of what had changed and what had yet to come. When she reached her building, she paused for just a moment before stepping inside, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if crossing that threshold marked a return to something she knew, even if it no longer felt exactly the same. The apartment greeted her with its quiet familiarity, the soft creak of the floor, the stillness of the air, everything in its place, unchanged, and yet she noticed it differently now, as if seeing it through a new lens, one that included the possibility of someone else being part of it. She moved to Oliver's cot, lowering him carefully, her hands steady as she adjusted his blanket, watching for a moment as he settled, his small face relaxed, untouched by the complexity that surrounded him, and she allowed herself to stay there a little longer, her fingers brushing lightly against his cheek, grounding herself in the simple truth that had guided her through everything so far. "We are still us," she whispered softly, the words gentle, not as a reassurance she needed to convince herself of, but as a reminder of what would always come first. She stepped back slowly, moving toward the small table where the card still rested, exactly where she had left it, and this time, she picked it up without hesitation, her fingers tracing the clean edge, the weight of it no longer something she avoided, but something she acknowledged. Lucas Bennett. The name no longer felt distant, no longer just a figure tied to a world far removed from hers, but something closer, something that now existed within the same space as her own life. She turned it over once more, her thoughts quiet, steady, not searching for answers anymore, but accepting that they would come, in time, in their own way. Across the city, Lucas stood in his office once again, the skyline stretching beyond the glass. But his focus was not on the view, not on the endless movement of the world he had built, but on something far simpler, far more personal. The memory of the day replayed not as a sequence of events, but as moments, small details that had settled into something permanent. The way Oliver had reached for him, the way Emily had held her ground without hesitation, the way everything had shifted without force, without intention, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to happen. His phone rested on the desk, silent for now. The usual demands of his world paused, not because they had disappeared, but because for once he had chosen to place something else at the center. He moved slowly, his hand resting briefly against the desk before he sat, the weight of decision not unfamiliar to him, but different this time, because it was not about strategy, not about outcomes. It was about presence, about choosing to step into something that could not be controlled in the same way. He picked up his phone then, not to issue instructions, not to gather information, but to act on something simpler, something more direct, and as he dialed, his expression remained steady, not uncertain, not rushed, just clear. Back in her apartment, Emily sat quietly, the card still in her hand, her gaze drifting toward the window where the last of the light faded into night. And when her phone rang, the sound felt different, not unexpected, but significant in a way she could not ignore. She looked at the screen for a moment, the name there confirming what she already knew, and for a second, she simply held it, feeling the weight of choice, the quiet understanding that answering would mean stepping forward, not answering would mean holding back, and neither option was as simple as it once might have been. Oliver shifted slightly in his sleep, a soft sound that broke the moment just enough to remind her of what mattered most, and she exhaled slowly, her thumb moving before she could overthink it, answering the call with a quiet steadiness that reflected everything she had already decided without fully realizing it. "Hello," she said softly, her voice calm, grounded, and on the other end, Lucas paused for just a fraction of a second, as if acknowledging the significance of that simple connection, before responding. "Emily," he said, his voice low, steady, and in that single word, there was no distance left, no separation of worlds, only the beginning of something that neither of them had planned, but both had chosen to face. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of possibility, of uncertainty, of something quietly unfolding beyond either of their control, and as Emily listened, as